Okay, I'm Jim Walsh. I've been collecting World War II aviation products for about 40 years. The reason I got started with that is I was a young man when World War II was on in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was born. And they had Curtiss Wright aircraft factory there. They had the Waco glider factory there. They had a small arms ammunition factory there. And then they had Jefferson Barracks, which is a big military base just south of us. It's been active since the Civil War. So I saw the war. I remember clearly, I was 9 years old when the war ended. I was always interested in aviation, and so that laid the foundation for my collection. This collection was not from eBay. I bought every piece here in the collection. In Europe, we lived in Warsaw, Poland, so I would buy a lot in Poland, and then we'd visit Russia and Germany, but primarily Russia, and I would go to Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in Poland, it was so interesting because the Germans occupied Poland from the war started in Poland in 1939, and the Germans invaded Poland. That's what was the beginning of World War II. So they had a huge collection of German, Russian military items. And so they would be selling these on the street when we were there only 10 years after communism fell. So the citizens would go into the military factories and things and just steal the items. And so they would be selling an item worth $500–600 for $10, $15. So every day I'd go out in the street and I would purchase these things and then I would ship them back to the United States. We were there for 3 years. There was also an antique dealer there that we would visit frequently and I would buy from him. And then there's soccer stadium. Once a week they would have a flea market like in the stadium. And I would go to that and buy. And that's how I got primarily the German, the Polish, and the Russian goods. I belong to an organization called SOS, and they have a big convention. I think I'm going in 2 weeks in Louisville, Kentucky, and they have 1,000 tables where 1,000 vendors are selling their goods. And I went every year and I bought Japanese things from there and publications. And all the weapons you see all fire. The pistols, the rifles fire. There's only 2 machine guns I have that don't fire. Federal law requires that they be plugged. But I bought those primarily in New Jersey because in Europe you can't buy firearms. So in New Jersey, there was a vendor in Mendham, New Jersey, and one in Peapack, New Jersey, and I had a license to be a gun dealer. And so I bought all the equipment, all the weapons in New Jersey, except for one item, and that was M1 carbine, which is outlawed in the United States, but I bought it from a pawn shop in Reno, Nevada, and took it apart and sent the parts back. So that's the example of where I got the stuff. Again, I started with just 2 items. And then when Chris built this house 7 years ago, she decided to take 1 bedroom and have it converted into a museum. So the builder took all the plumbing fixtures out, and this was built as a museum. So that was the whole purpose of it. Let's come on in. This is the World War I collection, and it's primarily aviation. And during World War I started in 1914, and the United States never entered the war until 1917, and the war ended in 1918. So these are primarily European, German, French, and British pilot helmets. The goggles and leather caps. I'll put this back. This is a big example of different kinds of goggles because they flew where the air temperature was below 0. And these aircraft were just made out of linen. So they were very cold, they had no heating. And you can see they even had a kind of an air filter. That wasn't an oxygen mask because the planes never had oxygen at that particular time. Okay. I like to point over here to this helmet. This is important to me because this is my grandfather's helmet. He wore it in World War I in France. He was a private in the United States Army, so he got over there around 1917. And it stayed in the family. My brother Jack gave it to me a few years ago. He'd had it prior to that. So that's an example of how the U.S. would have helmets like that to protect their head. Also, we have barometers, and these barometers were actually altimeters. And today in our airplanes still use a barometer to measure altitude. So this was a crude altimeter, And remember, this occurred only 11 years after Orville and Wilbur Wright flew, and they never had an altimeter. So it was important that they know what altitude they were at. This would be the examples of a typical aircraft. This is a German Luger, a pistol they used in Germany in World War I and also World War II is an excellent pistol. This would be a typical U.S. soldier's hat. Here's a picture of a U.S. soldier. And this could be a sergeant or a drill sergeant. This is a photograph of him. The communication in the battlefield was by telephone, part of the time. And the other part of the time was by carrier pigeons. They would put a little message in this capsule, release the pigeon, and it would fly back to headquarters with a message. When it wasn't in active flying, they had a pigeon carrier case that they would use, made out of straw. The war started out with a so-so popularity, and the government tried to use propaganda to get people excited about World War I. So what they did is they came out with these posters, and here's a little girl being taken away by a German soldier, and the caption reads, "Somebody's little girl, suppose she's yours, buy U.S. war bonds." So they had a propaganda operation going back then in World War I. Over here I just have some toy soldiers that demonstrate the kind of equipment they used in World War I, and you can see that here. If a soldier was killed on either side, they had a religious mass card. They would have a picture of the soldier, his date, a little prayer, and that would be used to remember him in terms of his mortality. This small section is the items from the Spanish Civil War, which was 1936-1937. Franco was the prime minister and director and dictator of Spain, and his ally was Adolf Hitler. And then the communists were trying to overthrow him, and their ally was the Soviet Union. And so the war lasted just 1 year. But it was unique. They had unique weapons, and one of the unique weapons was this pistol. You never see anything like it. It's from the Spanish Civil War, only used by the Spanish. And then you can see that their headgear was different, and this is a patch of their military service. This bottom shelf contains medical instruments, first aid kits, first aid booklets from World War I and World War II. This particular booklet is in German. It's from World War I, and it's instructions on how to take care of wounded patients. Over here, this is a German first aid kit. And then we have American first aids and American first aid kits. We have bandages from World War I and World War II. These are first aid kits that they would carry in their backpack or in their belt. This is a surgical kit with some surgical instruments that would be used in World War II by either the medics or by the actual surgeons. I have something here that's unique. It's a can of ether, and there's still ether in the can, and it's from 1944, if you can imagine that. And the liquid is still in the ether can. That was the anesthetic that was used primarily during World War II. These hats up here are called pith helmets, and they were used in tropics and in the desert area. You know, part of the war was fought with Germany, at least, in North Africa, and the part with Japan was fought in the jungles. So this is a Japanese pith helmet that an officer would wear, protect him from the sun. This is British, this is US, this is Japanese, and this is German. So I have about a dozen of these pith helmets. And they were very common to be worn to really protect you only from the sun, because they were made out of almost paper, so if you were shot at, it's not like wearing a helmet. All right, behind me I have jackets that were worn by the pilots in the various forms of the governments they served under. This is a Navy officer in World War II, a pilot. This is an Army U.S. Air, we didn't have an Air Force, it was called U.S. Army Air Corps. And that was the pilot. This is a Polish pilot. The Polish were invaded by the Germans, and then their military moved to London, and they fought alongside the U.S. and the British. And so this is a Polish pilot. This was a very elite group of German armed forces. This is land, and this is their officer. And this is a Lufthansa. This is the German Air Force. So we have Air Force, Air Force, Air Force, Air Force, and land. Okay, I'm going to describe one of our enemies in World War II. It was the country of Italy. And their dictator was Benito Mussolini. And here's Life magazine had a photograph of him. He got the people all fired up, and then they became an ally of the Nazis. And our first big invasion of Europe was in Sicily, and then invasion of Rome. And the people actually overthrew him and hung him. But the war continued on for a couple of years after that. So here's some examples of, it reflects the Italian culture as much as anything. These are very colorful military hats that the Italians would use. You think about their Italian clothing style and their military style. This is Italian. This is Italian. This actually used horse tail hairs. This is a very flamboyant Italian. And then the Beretta, that's a very famous pistol that they used. This is a Italian paratrooper helmet. And this is another picture of Mussolini. And here's another picture of Mussolini. And here's some caricatures of Mussolini down in here. This is their primary aircraft, Italian aircraft. But they weren't really tough fighters. And as soon as we invaded Sicily, they pretty much gave up. And the Germans had to fight for them during the rest of World War II. This section down here, including this dagger, this is all some overflow I have of Germany. I have a real extensive collection of Nazi and German World War II materials. And I didn't have enough space for it, so I put it down here. So these are gas masks and stamps and items they wore for decorations and support. Even a mail pouch over here, the Postal Service has a Nazi symbol on it. I remember buying this. It's a civilian gas mask because there was concern by the Germans that the Americans were going to gas the citizens. So they had these gas masks available for the citizens. And over here, and I bought this at in Warsaw at the antique shop. Over here, these are letters sent by American war prisoners back to their families because they were captured and in prison, some of them in Stalag, and they were still allowed through the Red Cross to be able to send notices back, and their families kept these letters. These were World War II models. This is an actual altimeter. I showed you the primitive one from World War I. This is World War II, and it's pretty much the one we use today. It's a barometer, but it shows the elevation. These three airplanes, this is a Corsair, which is a very famous Navy fighter in World War II and in Korea. This is a training airplane, and then this is a P-47 Thunderbolt, which is a big fighter. It's the heaviest fighter we used in the United States, World War II. Okay, this collection is about the role that women played in World War II. They weren't allowed to fight in active combat, but they were all volunteers, and each service had its own particular auxiliary corps of women. This is the Navy, this is the Army and the Army Air Corps, this is the United States Marine Corps. And again, a lot of the women served as nurses. This is a nurse uniform. But an elite group of them became pilots. Here's their symbol. And you can see from Life magazine they have an example of that. And these women were called the Fly Girls. And what they did is they flew airplanes from the military factories in Seattle and Kansas to the war zone, to Britain, and then the U.S. pilots would take over and fly them into combat. So this was a very qualified pilot. Here's an example of a woman instructor and her student. And they played a big role in the war because it relieved a lot of men from that activity. And you can't believe we had thousands and thousands of airplanes that we were flying across the ocean. And they would fly to Newfoundland, and then you'd go to Greenland, and then to Scotland, and then back over, because they didn't have enough fuel to go right across the ocean. So think how dangerous that was. And there'd be 2 women or 3 women in the airplane, no men. I have over 200 copies of Life magazines. My only requirement was they had to have a picture of an airplane or something to do with the Air Force on the cover. In many cases in these magazines, there wasn't even an article inside about this particular cover picture. So this one is our P-47 Thunderbolt fighter. It was the heaviest fighter we had, and it's a very effective weapon, and it had a picture of that. This one shows a transport glider and a crew in training. This one was our primary bomber, the B-17. This one is a pilot in flight training. This is interesting too, because during World War II, we had something called barrage balloons. Every side used them. There were balloons that were tethered on a cable, and the idea was that the airplane attacking you would hit these cables and be destroyed. So it was used in D-Day, and it was used extensively in Sicily. So these are barrage balloons. This is a cockpit of a B-29 on its mission to bomb Japan. They did a lot of firebombing in 1945. They took off from Okinawa, and then eventually the atomic bomb was dropped from this aircraft. Here's a photograph of a bombardier, and he would be the one that would drop the bombs from the airplane. They're always officers. This is of a Chinese pilot. China was our ally in World War II, and they fought with us to defeat the Japanese. This is interesting because it's not about aviation, but I'm a horse guy, and we had a cavalry in World War II. We actually had horse soldiers in World War II. The Germans, because they were short of fuel, had a lot more horses and carried them and used them all the way to the end of the war, but we dismounted the cavalry about in 1942. But this was a major source of information for the people in the United States. They bought this magazine, they looked at the pictures, and this is how they learned about the war. Okay, the next section we're going to talk about is the Soviet Union, now called Russia. And this is an example of an officer's uniform in World War II. It was made of very harsh, cheap material. This was an enlisted person. It was just rough wool. It must have itched tremendously for anybody that wore it. I think we ought to say something about Russia, first of all. The reason we won World War II was because of the Russians, because Hitler decided to attack Russia, which was a very stupid mistake, and then he put a lot of his armies on the Eastern Front, and so he couldn't fight us. He was fighting the Russians. The Russians had a lot of fatalities. I think 20 million people were killed in Russia, much more than the United States or Western Europe. But because they were communist and because they were difficult to deal with, we really downplayed their role in World War II. But historians are just amazed at what they were able to achieve. Under a dictator, Stalin, he was brutal. He sacrificed his own people. He was a tyrant. He was just as bad as Adolf Hitler. But he was our ally. And he kept Hitler involved and tied up a lot of his troops in the Eastern Front. So this collection that I have here is pretty extensive because Russia occupied Poland during World War II, the end of World War II, and then they occupied them all the way till 1989. So we have a lot of examples of Soviet war items that were left there or stolen by the Polish people from the Russians. So we have tanks, model airplanes. These model airplanes I got from a fellow who imported them. They were handmade, and he imported them from the Soviet Union to Thousand Oaks, California. And then I would order them from them. So these are all special models that you couldn't get anywhere else. You'll see we have Soviet pistols and the clothing. Everything there was very crude because They didn't have advanced technologies. They went with basically numbers. Again, Soviet airplanes, pictures of the Soviet soldiers. And I have probably the heaviest weapon. I have my whole collection. Oh my God. This is a automatic weapon. You would call it a Tommy gun, I guess. It probably weighs 50 pounds. That's without ammunition. And now you put ammunition here, the thing's got to weigh 80 pounds. And you imagine carrying this across, because they didn't have much motor transportation. You had to carry this with you all the time that you fought in the action. The Soviet Union didn't have much of an air force, so the airplanes are pretty primitive. And so what we did in the United States is we sent our aircraft over there to be flown by the Soviets. So the majority of their airplanes, certainly in the beginning of the war, were U.S. airplanes, planes that we didn't want, planes that weren't performing well for us. We just shipped them over to the Russians, and they used them as their primary air force. So you can see this particular collection has limited aviation and a lot of ground stuff. They were big on medals. Each time a tank was produced, they would produce a model for the commanding officer, and that would be his symbol of his effectiveness. This is a aircraft instrument, attitude indicator from a Soviet plane. This is a pitch control, and but mostly it's land stuff, and they were tough. They weren't friendly, and Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin met in Yalta in 1945, and they agreed to how they were going to set up the peace in World War II, and then Stalin broke all the agreements, and then this is going to lay the groundwork for the Cold War, which we're going to cover later in our next discussion. We're going to talk about the flight gear that the pilots use in a variety of climates, but the planes were not pressurized. They were just thin aluminum, so as they got above freezing level, the temperature could get 20 degrees below zero on those airplanes. So they would have, sometimes they'd have a underwear that was heated with electric wires, but they always used these heavy sheepskin trousers, and then these jackets, and then these boots to keep them warm, and special gloves. It wasn't just restricted to the U.S. because I have a rare thing here. I have the Japanese high-level pilots, or the Japanese bombers, wore the same kind of things to protect themselves. Then as we got into milder climates, we had these light suits, the U.S. This would be the U.S. This is a Navy flight jacket that they would have lights in case they went down. This would be inflated, so it would be a life jacket. And then they would usually have a pistol. Over here, this is a German. This is a German Luftwaffe, the German pilots, and they would have a leather jacket. So that concludes this. This is a collection of predominantly aviation equipment, but I do have some land equipment, some tank equipment. I purchased this various places. We lived in London, and I'll talk about the British goggles and British helmets that I bought, and I got those from two shops, in particular in London, that specialize in this. The others, there's a big military show every year in Louisville, Kentucky called SOX, Show of Shows. They have 1,000 tables, and I pretty much go every other year. And I purchased some of that there. So it's a variety of places. To start with, these are German helmets, these three. These three right here are German. And this one is a German police helmet that they used in World War II, and these are German military. And over here, this is a helmet used for German paratroopers. So these are all German. This is British. And then over here, this is a German pilot helmet, and you can see there's no top on it because of the heat. In the tropics and in Africa where they fought, the pilots would wear this. So it would give them a headset, a throat microphone, and goggles, but there would be just their hair, no cap for heat. I also have some tank equipment. And this looks like a football helmet. But it was a copy of one, but it's what the people that drove tanks and lived in the tanks for U.S. in World War II. It protected them from damage somewhat, and it was just like modified helmet of a football player in the 1940s. This helmet was unique. You notice that there's a rubber cord and there's almost a mouthpiece here. Because there was this shortage in the beginning of World War II of radio equipment, this would be the student pilot, and he would be sitting in the front of the airplane, and in the back of the airplane the instructor would be sitting, and he'd be talking like this, and the sound would go through the hose, just like you did with kids in the backyard, and the student would hear it that way. That's how they communicated early of World War II. This is a headgear that would be worn by a glider pilot. We'll have examples of that in here, but they had quite a few wooden gliders that would carry troops. And there would be a pilot and a co-pilot that would fly the gliders. And they had this symbol of a glider and a parachute. And they would usually have a headset like this. And they would talk to the tow plane, which is usually a C-47. These helmets, these goggles like this with a crack in them, I got in London. These are all British goggles. They were favored by the Americans. So during World War II, if the Americans were stationed, and a lot of them were stationed in England, flying bombers and things, they would purchase these. And these would be the unofficial preferred goggle, not the American goggle. This is an example of the cheap American goggle. This is one. Here's one over here, American goggle. This is American goggle. This is British, American. You can see why you would prefer, you can see clear out of them, the foreign goggles. And this is unique because on our bombers, the B-17, the B-24s, the crew would put this on to protect them from enemy aircraft fire and also from anti-aircraft fire. So it would be a helmet worn over this helmet to protect them. It was very heavy and awkward, and so they only put it on when they were right over Germany and being shot at. All of these German items I purchased in Poland. The war began September 1st, 1939 in Gdansk, where Germany invaded Poland. That was the beginning of World War II. We didn't enter it until December 41, 2 years later. Germany invaded Poland and took over Poland and occupied it throughout the entire war. So there was a lot of German equipment left, and the Polish people had it. And after the Germans were driven out in 1944-45, the Soviets came in, and they controlled Poland until the fall of communism in 1989. So there was a wide collection of this equipment available to almost every household in Poland. These people had really suffered from occupation of Germans and then follow the occupations of Russians. So I purchased these in various shops and also on the street. Everybody was looking for money, so they were selling these things. I got these guns, actually, both of these in New Jersey, from a gun dealer in Mendham, New Jersey. But everything else came from Poland. So you can see when we moved, well, when we were living there, I was always sending these artifacts back in crates and boxes and things back to New York. This is part of my German collection. The other part is around the corner because I didn't have enough space. But people didn't realize that we bombed most of the oil facilities the German used. They were in Romania. And so during the war, Germany was real short of petrol. And so they had to rely on horses. So a vast number of horses were used, and this by the Germans primarily. And they even had the extent of having a horse gas mask. This is a gas mask that you would put on a horse because they were feared that the United States would use gas like mustard gas was used in World War I. And these are spurs that they would use. So if you ever see World War II pictures of the German army, you'll see a large number of horses moving supplies and moving the troops. At the same time, they were very advanced in technology. This was the first jet plane ever developed, the Me-262. So the first jet aircraft ever used in the world was a fighter designed by Germany. So they had horses moving the infantry, and their Air Force, this was early radar. And not only did they develop that, but they also had V-2 rockets. These were the first early rockets. These were fired from France to Britain, and they did a lot of damage. They were guided missiles, no pilot in there, jet engine. We never had anything like this. So when the war ended, what we did is, there was a famous German, Werner von Braun, and he was a young scientist, and he was in charge of this facility, and we took him and moved him to Alabama to the Redstone Arsenal, and that became the center of the U.S. space program in the late 50s and early 60s. This is a famous German Luger. It was a pistol used in World War I. It was used in World War II. This is another different model of their pistols. These are actual shells that I've purchased, real ammunition. This is the aviation goggles. You can see they're so different than the British or the U.S. They look pretty cheap. And it has a mesh hat up here because of the temperatures. And these are aircraft instruments. These are all in German. Attitude indicator, airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon. These are the German aircraft, some of them. This one here is the fastest piston plane ever developed. There's this plane is in the Air and Space Museum at Dulles Air Force Base, Dulles Museum in Washington, D.C. And it was a propeller in the back and a propeller in the front, and it was large. They only made about a half a dozen of them. This is the jet, the ME-262. They always used daggers for decorations. They had them over here. And tanks. And just a big collection of different sorts of metals and paraphernalia that they use. This was the most famous light aircraft in World War II. It was really ugly looking. It was called the Storch, S-T-O-R-C-H. In fact, Hitler used this airplane to have his troops fly in and free Mussolini from prison after the communists caught him in World War II. And it was the best light aircraft ever developed, the Storch. Okay. I also have a wide collection here of German aviation magazines. I probably have 100 of these. And during World War II, they had two aviation magazines they published. One was called Signal, and the other was called Adler. And I have two baskets full of these. And Life magazine, before the war, did a cover of a German submarine. That's in 1939. The war began in 1940. That was just before the war. Actually, it was just after the war. The war started September 1, 1939. This is October 16th, 1939. Okay, this section is the United States. And I got this primarily from military shows and vendors. And I attend a lot of those shows. But I never got any of this online. All this was purchased by me seeing it, handling it, and touching it. So it was primarily focused on the aircraft because I'm a pilot. And it's U.S. action in World War II. This is an interesting collection here. These are hard rubber models that would be hanging in a briefing room by a little wire to help the pilots identify different kinds of aircraft. So they're all hard rubber. They weren't plastic. And this is a Black Widow, a United States plane, and they had German planes and quite a collection. I also have various models here. And these are all aviation instruments. This is a rare piece here. This is, I'll get this off here. This is a bag, and a lot of crews wore these bags like this and breathed through this rubber. So it wasn't an oxygen mask as we know it, but it was a different kind of oxygen. They kind of preferred this because they could speak clearer and it wouldn't be so cumbersome. There's just a collection of toy soldiers I have. And these are all various instruments from World War II aircraft. This is our primary weapon. It's so different than the Soviet Union because it's called the M1 carbine. It's very light. And it had a clip. It held about 20 rounds. It could be automatic or semi-automatic. And this was a preferred weapon for the soldiers to carry because it was so light. And it was fairly effective at close range. This is our bomber that dropped the atomic bomb, Enola Gay. This is a B-29. This is a B-25. It's probably the most versatile bomber we had in World War II. This is a collection I have of wings. These are all different kinds of wings of pilots, navigators, flight instructors, bombardiers, and they're all sterling silver. Let's see, what else can I tell you about? This was called a grease gun. It was an automatic weapon, similar to the one I had, but paratroopers would use this. The stock was collapsible, and they would jump out of the airplane with this, and it was an automatic weapon. Again, light compared to what the Russians had, and it was very effective. Here's stationery that the soldiers would send to their families. They had special stationery. We had an observation corps. They didn't have that much radar, so they had citizens that would sit on top of their house or on the roof of their garage with a pair of binoculars looking for enemy aircraft, because we were afraid that, especially on the west coast, and for the Japanese on the east coast, German, that the bombers would fly from Europe and bomb us. So this is part of the U.S. Army Air Force Observer Corps. And you had a patch, and these are different medals and pins and badges. This is a pair of goggles that was used for training pilots to fly on instruments. So you put this on, you couldn't see, and then you were flying blind, and then the instructor would check and make sure you're flying properly. So it's called a hood today, but that's what they use then. Again, aviation. This is a P-51 Mustang. This is our best fighter, probably the best fighter in World War II. And I have a complete instrument panel, which I'll show you later, removed from that aircraft. Up here is, the constellation and attitude indicators. These are all official working instruments from World War II. Now, I mentioned glider. Gliders played a big role in Europe, and especially in D-Day and things. And this is an actual cushion of what the soldiers sat on in these gliders. They had just one little seat belt. It was such a dangerous thing. They sat sideways. And here is examples of the gliders that they used. This is called the Waco glider right there. It held about 30 soldiers with equipment, and it was towed by the C-47. And this is an example of that cap. I showed you one earlier with the helmet. This would be what the pilot would wear. That shows a parachute and a glider. This is a warrant officer, not a lieutenant, but this is one grade below that. And this is some photography equipment and various aviation equipment. And this is our famous Colt 45. It was a sidearm used by Air Force and the Army and the Navy. It was very reliable and heavy. That was our primary weapon. Again, we had no jet aircraft. All our airplanes were propellers, piston. We didn't develop a jet airplane until, well, we started working on one in 1945. Bell had one, but it was called the Comet, but we never brought it out into service. These planes would fly probably at 300 miles an hour, and the jets that the Germans had would fly at 600 miles an hour. So you can see that they would just outgun and outfight and shoot down most of the propeller planes. The advantage of us was they had very few of these, and we had a lot of propeller-driven aircraft. This is the P-51 Mustang fighter. It was our best fighter. It was brought out by the United States, and we had an underpowered engine in it. And so the British said, we'll take it, and they put a Merlin engine in it, a very powerful engine, and that turned out to be a winning airplane. So we incorporated the British engine into the plane. The plane actually was so good it flew and fought in Korea as well. This is rare because this is the entire instrument panel from that airplane. So you don't see it like that. I bought this at an air show in upstate New York, and the guy had removed it from this plane, this model plane, and it has all the actual instruments that were used. So it's just intact, and that's rare to see this. So I've had this probably 15 or 20 years. I actually had to take it, I flew up commercially, so I had to put this in a suitcase and bring it back, and that's how I got it back home. And it's heavy, because all the instruments are quite heavy. There were different types of parachutes. We have different examples here. And also safety parachutes. And this is the predominant one that pilots would use. They would actually sit on this thing. This is their seat. They'd have a metal seat, and then they would sit on this, put this on their back, and this is another variation of it over here. You can see how large it is and how cumbersome it is. And they would have that on during a flight. And then the people that skydivers, were called paratroopers, they had a little different arrangement. Their parachute was designed differently than the pilots, and they also had a safety parachute. So if their main parachute didn't work, this was their safety one. And they had to pull the ripcord, this cord right here, and if that opened, they would survive. If it didn't, they would die. But the pilots didn't have the reserve. They just had this prominent one here. This is just one example of British publications. It's the war in pictures, and it shows a British soldier in front of one of our Air Force planes that we dedicated and gave to them. I also wanted to show you this picture. This is one of the leading generals of the United States, General George Patton, and he was a tank guy. And you can see him wearing that tank helmet that I showed you from our earlier scenes, like a football helmet. Here's another example of General Patton in a tank, American tank. We're going to talk about the third arm of our victory, really. It was Franklin Roosevelt leading the United States, Joseph Stalin leading the Soviet Union, and Winston Churchill leading England. And so we're going to talk about the British role. I've been using this stick to point out things, but this is actually a British officer's swagger stick. So they carried this for a sign of authority. It's like we maybe carry a sword or something. The officer would carry this, called a British swagger stick. So up here is the British glider. It's called a Horsa, H-O-R-S-A. And it was quite a bit larger. It was probably twice the size of the American Waco glider, and much better. So on D-Day, America used a lot of these Horsa gliders to bring our troops in to land on D-Day, rather than the Wacos. So I would say it would be 3/4 American-built Waco gliders and 1/4 British-built Horsa gliders. This is a British seaplane. It was a transport plane. It was used in World War II and also used in the Berlin airlift. And this is one of their fighters, a submarine. It was used in World War II and is also used in the Korean War. This is a Lancaster bomber. This is their famous bomber equal to our B-17. This is the Bristol bomber, a twin-engine plane. It was very effective. You notice down here we have the British goggles with a crease in there. And the British pistol, they used a revolver. They had a automatic weapon that was almost as heavy as the Soviet Union's. And it was designed differently. This had the magazine on the side rather than underneath, and it was quite heavy. So you have to carry this thing, and when you had shells in there, it would be like this. It was awkward, but it was their primary automatic weapon. They had like us, they had observers. They had a civil defense corps that they wear these on their arm. And then they had a home guard. Same thing. They took a lot of our aircraft and just put the British colors on it. So this is a Hellcat, a Navy plane, U.S. made, and then they made it into British. They have a book where they flew the B-17s, and they flew our bombers because we supplied them. But these aircraft are actually the British. And then Canada was one of our allies, and I have a patch of Canada. They supplied some troops on D-Day and so on. Okay. We're going to now look at the Japanese part of my collection. Life magazine had a feature of the Emperor of Japan, and there he is on his horse. And remember, World War II for us didn't begin in 1939, which that's what happened to Germany and France and England. But ours happened December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese deliberately attacked Pearl Harbor from their aircraft carriers. So after the attack, Germany declared war on us, and we declared war on Germany, but Germany didn't attack us. It was the Japanese. And these are examples of, this is a compass from a Japanese fighter plane. This is a Japanese rifle. Again, quite heavy. It was bolt action. These are Japanese flags that they carried into battle, and they were often signed by supporters and relatives. This is a Japanese pistol. It's a unique pistol. Let's see here. The officer would carry this, and because they believed in suicide and not surrendering, if the officer was captured, he hit a lever, and he would hand the pistol to the American, and they would go off and kill the officer. It was built in. It's the only pistol like that. It had a suicide feature built into the pistol. Mostly this is aviation. These are the various aircraft the Japanese had. They were inferior to anything we had. They didn't have armor plating in it, so consequently if a fighter shot at it, the bullets just went right through the fuselage and killed the pilot. Or if anti-aircraft was shot at it, it's the same thing. So they were not leading edge technology, and they were soon obsolete in the war. Okay, this is a little display section of my own personal flying. I flew the first airplane in my life, Piper Cub, J3 Piper Cub. And these are my logbooks. Each one of these are filled with hours that I flew. So I have a large number of hours. I have 4,200 hours, and I've flown in about 15 different aircraft. This picture was given to me by a friend of mine, Al Thomas, 50 years ago when we were flying a 172. I just sat in the cockpit of a C-130. I wasn't actually flying it. This is a Piper Archer that I fly frequently. And this is a 172 that I was flying, and this picture was done in 1976. I belong to a kind of a unique group. It's UFO, United Flying Octogenarians. It's all pilots that are over 80 years of age that are still active pilots. And there's about 2,000 of them, and I'm one of the members of that organization. I think that'll do it. This is a unique thing for me. It's a Polish pilot's license. So when I was in Warsaw, I applied and got certified, and I have a active Polish pilot's license. So I have a private pilot license in the United States, I have an instrument pilot license in the United States, and I have a Polish instrument and private license in Poland. This is a unique photo because when I was in Poland, I flew every week with an airline pilot. The Polish airline was called LOT, L-O-T, and his name was Andrzej Schnig. And when we returned from Poland to the United States, it was in September the 10th, and I flew in the cockpit with Andrzej, and he had a photograph taken of me in the cockpit. Well, then 9/11, you're not allowed to do this anymore, so it's a rare photograph of somebody actually sitting in the cockpit. I wasn't flying the airplane, but the plane was flying across the ocean between Warsaw and New York City.